When I was diagnosed myself with ADHD back in my mid 1950s, sorry, not mid 1950s, in my mid 50s. I'm not that old. I never bought into the idea that we're dealing with a genetic disease here. That made no sense to me. And here's why it made no sense to me. First of all, if anything is spreading in a population that quickly, it can't be genetic. Because genes don't change in a population over 10 years, over 20 years, not even 100 years. So whatever it is, it's not genetic. Secondly, I knew something by then. And what I knew, that tuning out, which is the hallmark, you remember the prefrontal cortex function, one of them is regulation of the body. Well, I didn't know that. But here's what I did know. I knew that tuning out is not a disease. On the contrary, what actually is tuning out? Why did nature give us the capacity to tune out, to dissociate? Why do you think that is? It's a survival mechanism. It's a survival mechanism. If I were to stress you right now by threatening you, or just insulting your dignity as a human being, you'd have three healthy options. One would be to walk out, escape, flight. The other would be to fight, to challenge me, stand up for yourself. And if for whatever reason you're unable to engage in either of those modalities, you have a third one. There are hundreds of people here in the room with you. You could seek help. You could say, please help me. This guy's bugging me. But if none of those were available to you, and the stress was immense and intense, what your mind would do, what your brain would do, was escape from that. And one of the ways of escaping would be to just dissociate, to tune out. So tuning out is not a disease. It's a nature-given capacity that we have to escape overwhelming stress. That's what I knew. What I didn't know, and found out really almost by accident, was that the human brain itself, the very circuits in the prefrontal cortex that I mentioned, those functions, that develops under the impact of the environment. So that which circuits develop, which prefrontal circuits develop, and how the emotional circuits develop, depends very much on the early environment. And the example is that of vision. If you don't see light for 5 years after birth, it doesn't matter how good your eyes are, how good your genes are, you'll be blind for the rest of your life, because it takes light waves to promote the development of the visual circuits. It's that simple. With the emotional self-regulation circuits that are not functioning very well in a lot of kids these days, with the attentional circuits that are not functioning very well, with the impulse regulation circuits, with the stress regulation circuits, it's the same thing. Just like light is needed for vision, the right environment is needed for those circuits to develop. I'm talking about the physiological development. I'm talking about the neurochemistry of the brain. I'm talking about oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, endorphins, gabapentin. Not gabapentin, but yeah. All the important neurochemicals that modulate our behaviors. The quantities of them, their interaction, the circuits that modulate them, they depend on the environment for their development. And the human brain is particularly vulnerable because, unlike other animals, most of our brain development occurs after birth, not before. But also before. So we also know we also know that already what happens in pregnancy has significant impact on the developing brain of the child. So the more stressed women are, the more likely the kids are going to be affected. So if we're looking at the preponderance of autism and all kinds of other childhood conditions, what are we looking at? We're looking at the impact of stress on the parenting environment, including on pregnant women. A study after 9/11 looked at the stress hormone levels of 1-year-old infants whose mothers had suffered post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of 9/11 during pregnancy. And these children at 1 year of age had abnormal stress hormone levels, which means that their stress regulation circuitry had been negatively affected by their mother's stress during pregnancy, which means they're more prone for addictions and behavior problems, by the way, and learning difficulties. Because too much cortisol, the stress hormone, interferes with learning and actually shrinks the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain responsible for retaining memory. They looked at the genetic functioning. We have this whole idea that genes regulate things and that genetics control things. They do not. Genes are turned on and off by the environment. That study is called epigenetics. Epigenetics is how genes are regulated by the environment. So that in both in human studies and animal studies, we know that even if people have certain genes that might predispose them to addictions, if they're brought up in nurturing environments, those genes are turned off. So this UBC study looked at 150 genes in teenagers, the expression, which is the activity of the genes. 120 of them had been affected by stress on the mother in the first year. 30 had been affected by stress on the father in the preschool years. So that the stresses on the parents translate into the genetic expression of the teenagers a decade later. So that the environment actually modulates the activity of genes. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning and behavior that follow. And then they say the interaction of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. So the key issue is the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships. So that is a spectrum. On the one hand, you can have the calm, non-depressed, emotionally present, attuned parent. And on the other, you can have the parent who abuses the child, traumatizes the child. Now, in the downtown east side of Vancouver, over a 12-year period, I did not have a single female patient who had not been sexually abused as a child. So the people that our government is jailing in large numbers are people that have been traumatized as children. That's just the society that we live in. In between that calm, attuned, non-stressed parenting environment, which incidentally is what people offer themselves when they practice mindful awareness modalities, as Dr. Hansen will tell you. They're giving themselves that attuned, quiet attention. That's why it works. In between that and the extreme of parents who actually act their own trauma out on their children by traumatizing them, there's a whole range. And in our society, that range is increasingly moving towards stress. Because parents no longer have the support they used to have, they no longer have the extended family, clan, tribe, village. There was an article out of Notre Dame University a couple of years ago. They looked at the optimal parenting environment, it was the hunter-gatherer tribe. Because in the hunter-gatherer tribe, parents were present physically, multiple adults of multiple generations were connecting emotionally with kids, the parents were always with the kids, and so on and so forth. Now, the most this has nothing to do with bad parenting. It has to do with stress parenting. The studies, again, are very clear. When parents are stressed, they're less able to attune to their kids. The less able to attune to their kids, the more likely their children's brain will not develop optimally. And that's what the educators you're up against these days. Now, when we look at, furthermore, what the impact of early stress is on the child's brain and the child's capacity to learn, what are we up against? Well, we're up against those coping mechanisms that the child adapted. So one coping mechanism was the dissociation, the tuning out. The problem is that when a child has to adapt these modalities chronically, early in childhood, that gets programmed into the brain. And then 10 years later, when Mike is 55 years later, that person is diagnosed with ADHD. Because there are times in the first year of life when every second, so consider this space of time, millions of circuits are being laid down, millions of connections are being made. It's that rapid, it's that intense, the brain growth. So if stress happens in a parent's life during that period, if the mother is depressed, for example, or the father overworked, or there's unresolved family issues, that will have an impact on the child. We're not talking about learned behaviors here. We're talking about emotional-based coping mechanisms. Now, that's one way the brain protects itself from stress. Another way that the brain protects itself from stress is a kind of emotional shutdown, of not being aware of feelings. Incidentally, when you all put your hand up and said that you'd had the experience of having strong gut feelings and ignoring it, you were telling the story of your childhood. Do you know that? And the story of your childhood is that your authentic emotions were not responded to by your parents. Not because they didn't love you, but because they themselves were too stressed. And that means you disconnected because it was too painful to have feelings that were not validated by the world.